It is the early hours of March 14th, 1943. Somewhere in the French countryside, a man is walking. Not quickly, not nervously, he walks with the measured, unhurried pace of someone who knows that panic will kill him faster than any German sentry. He wears a farmer's jacket, collarless, smelling of turned earth and tobacco. Beneath it, folded against his body in 3 separate pieces, is something that no French farmer has any business carrying. He reaches a hedgerow, ducks beneath it, and begins to assemble by touch alone. A receiver here. A barrel, longer than it should be, heavy with an interior the Germans have not yet encountered. A magazine slid home with barely a whisper of metal on metal. He rises, checks the field. 2 silhouettes at the gate. They are talking, smoking, entirely at ease with the occupied night around them. He moves towards them. There is no dramatic confrontation. There are 2 soft, truncated cracks, less loud than a car door closing, less noticeable than a branch breaking underfoot, and then there is silence again. The kind of silence that means the operation can proceed. What the man in that field was carrying was one of the most extraordinary and least celebrated weapons of the entire Second World War. It was British in origin, born from desperation and necessity, engineered in a small factory in Enfield, and refined in workshops so secret that their addresses still do not appear in mainstream histories. It was a weapon that changed the nature of clandestine warfare across an entire continent, that was coveted by Germany's most decorated commando officers, that served with Allied special forces for nearly 4 decades beyond the war in which it was born, and that still turns up occasionally in museum collections and private hands without most people ever understanding quite what they are looking at. It was the suppressed STEN, and the story of how it came to exist is the story of how Britain learned, under enormous pressure, to fight the war that nobody talks about. It begins not with triumph, but with failure. By late 1940, Britain's situation was as close to desperate as it is possible to be without actually losing. The country had evacuated its army from Dunkirk in a humiliation dressed up as a miracle. France had fallen. The Channel Islands were occupied. German bombers were delivering nightly lectures on the futility of resistance to the citizens of London, Coventry, and a dozen other cities. What Winston Churchill understood, with his characteristic instinct for the unconventional, was that the conventional war, the one fought by armies on open ground with tanks and artillery and air power, could not be won quickly, and perhaps could not be won at all in the near term. What he could do, while Britain rebuilt its strength, was make the occupation of Europe as painful, as expensive, and as psychologically exhausting for Germany as possible. In July 1940, he signed the order creating the Special Operations Executive, instructing it to, in his famous phrase, set Europe ablaze. What nobody quite anticipated was how difficult that would prove. SOE's first challenge was not courage. There was no shortage of men and women willing to parachute into occupied territory at night and work against the Germans. The challenge was practical. How do you kill a sentry without raising an alarm? How do you eliminate a collaborator on a crowded street without witnesses screaming? How do you conduct an assassination in a city where German soldiers are billeted on every corner, where informants are everywhere, where a single gunshot will bring a patrol running within minutes? The weapons available to SOE in 1940 and 1941 were designed for open battle, for the Western Front, for the kind of organized, declared warfare that had rules and identifiable front lines. They were entirely unsuited to the shadows. A Thompson submachine gun, the weapon of choice for British commandos in the early years, makes roughly the same noise as a small artillery piece when discharged. Useful for charging a machine gun nest. Catastrophically useless for quiet work in a city under occupation. SOE's Research Section, operating under the deliberately dull cover name of the Inter-Service Research Bureau, with its laboratories hidden at a country house in Welwyn, Hertfordshire, known as Station 9, began looking for answers. The brief was stark. What they needed was a weapon capable of automatic or semi-automatic fire, concealable when disassembled, reliable in field conditions, and quiet enough that its discharge would not carry beyond the immediate vicinity of its use. Experiments were conducted with suppressing the Thompson. Those experiments were a comprehensive failure. The weapon was too heavy, too complex, and the mechanics of its action too loud. The suppressor designs that were attempted either failed to reduce the report to acceptable levels or degraded the weapon's reliability to the point of uselessness. After months of effort, the Thompson was abandoned as a candidate. The solution, when it arrived, came from an unlikely source, and it came in part from Poland. The STEN gun itself was already one of the more remarkable engineering stories of the war. Designed in 1940 by Major Reginald Shepard and Harold Turpin at the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield, the name deriving from the first letters of their surnames combined with the factory's location, it had been conceived as a direct answer to catastrophe. Britain needed submachine guns by the hundreds of thousands, immediately, using materials that were available and factories that were already committed elsewhere. The result was a weapon of almost laughable simplicity: a tube, a bolt, a return spring, a trigger group, and a side-mounted magazine. No wooden stock in the conventional sense, no elegant machining, no pretension to beauty. A STEN gun could be manufactured in a workshop producing agricultural equipment. It could be assembled from bicycle parts and steel tubing, and in occupied Europe it eventually was. It was mocked by everyone who first saw it, and relied upon by everyone who ever used it. The Mk.2 variant, introduced in 1942, had one feature that made it uniquely suited for what Station 9 was attempting. Its barrel was detachable. It unscrewed easily, exposing the front of the receiver, making maintenance simple and transport straightforward. This was not an accident, but its implications went beyond anything the original designers had intended. When engineers at the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield began working on a suppressed variant, a project prompted by a formal request from SOE for a weapon suited to clandestine missions requiring substantial firepower, that removable barrel became the key to everything. What they produced was technically described as the carbine, machine carbine, STEN, 9mm Mark II, S. The designation S stood, officially, not for silenced nor suppressed, but for special purpose, a reminder, if one is needed, that the British government's talent for understatement was undiminished by the pressures of total war. The suppressor itself was a remarkable piece of engineering for its era. It measured roughly 31 centimeters in length, slightly longer than a standard school ruler, with a diameter of approximately 5.5 centimeters, roughly comparable to a tin of boot polish. Inside, it housed a series of metal baffles. Some versions used as many as 27 metal washers in a precise arrangement, separated by small chambers designed to trap and slow the expanding propellant gases as they followed the bullet down and out of the barrel. The barrel itself was ported, meaning that small holes had been drilled through it at intervals along its length, bleeding off gas pressure before the bullet exited the muzzle. This was the critical element. By venting the gas through those ports and into the baffle chambers rather than allowing it to escape behind the bullet at full pressure, engineers could reduce the weapon's muzzle velocity from approximately 365 meters per second, well above the speed of sound, to around 300 meters per second, safely below it. A bullet traveling faster than sound creates its own small sonic boom as it moves through the air. Drop it below the speed of sound, and that secondary crack disappears entirely. To compensate for the reduced gas pressure, which in a standard blowback-operated weapon like the STEN was what drove the bolt rearward to eject the spent case and chamber the next round, the engineers made two critical modifications. They lightened the bolt itself and removed several coils from the recoil spring. The result was a weapon that cycled reliably on the reduced energy available, feeding and ejecting with the mechanical consistency that clandestine operations demanded. There were limitations. Rapid, sustained fire heated the ported barrel and the baffles rapidly. A single 32-round magazine fired on full automatic could effectively destroy the suppressor's baffling system in one engagement. A canvas sleeve was issued to be worn over the barrel assembly as protection for the operator's hand. Users were trained to fire in short bursts or single shots, conserving both the suppressor and the silence it provided. The SOE operated its own parallel program at Station 9 in Welwyn, developing what became known as the well silencer, a variant of the suppression system reportedly drawing on designs contributed by Polish firearms specialists who had made their way to Britain after the fall of their country. Poland had been among the first nations to conduct serious research into suppressed weaponry for military use, and the expertise its engineers brought to Britain fed directly into the SOE's refined version of the Mark II S. The well silencer design utilized a different internal arrangement from the Royal Small Arms factory model, though both were built around the same fundamental principle of baffled gas expansion and velocity reduction. The first batch of suppressed STEN 110 weapons each Syrgin was delivered to SOE in September 1942. Production numbers for the Mark II S remain partially classified or ambiguous, but research suggests that approximately 5,776 examples were manufactured before the end of the war. A later version, the Mark VI S, which applied the suppression system to the more refined Mark V body, was produced in considerably larger numbers. Estimates place production at around 24,824 units. When disassembled, the suppressed STEN could be stored compactly enough to fit within a standard rucksack, allowing an operative to carry a primary weapon openly while concealing the STEN for use at the precise moment it was required. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. By 1943, the suppressed STEN was in active operational use across occupied Europe. SOE networks in France, Norway, Denmark, and the Low Countries were receiving the weapon, either in the hands of trained agents parachuted in from Britain or in supply canisters dropped by RAF aircraft at clandestine landing zones in farm fields by night. The precise scale of its use remains, as with so many SOE operations, deliberately obscured by decades of official reticence and the routine destruction of records that characterize the organization's attitude to its own history. SOE was never meant to be remembered. Its agents operated without uniforms, without the protections of the Geneva Convention, and in many cases without any official acknowledgement of their existence. The records that survive are incomplete by design. What those records do reveal is consistent. Resistance groups across France found the weapon invaluable for exactly the tasks it had been designed to accomplish. The German Das Reich Panzer Division, ordered to march from the Toulouse region to reinforce German positions in Normandy following the Allied landings in June 1944, was delayed for a full 17 days by SOE-backed ambushes and sabotage actions along its route. Not all of those actions were loud ones. Sentries disappear quietly. Communications officers can be removed without triggering alarms. The suppressed STEN was designed for precisely these moments, the surgical incisions that bled an army at the edges without ever confronting it directly. In Norway, where the terrain made large-scale operations difficult and German garrisons were both numerous and alert, the weapon found a particular utility among the small SOE-trained teams operating in the countryside. The character of Norwegian resistance operations, small cells, patient surveillance, precise and sudden action, suited the suppressed STEN precisely. Records from the period describe operations in which German-held installations were approached and sentries eliminated without the main garrison receiving any indication that anything was amiss until it was considerably too late. In Denmark, the geography presented different challenges. The country is largely flat, densely inhabited, and offered few natural hiding places for guerrilla forces. Resistance there depended heavily on the ability to act within populated areas without detection. The suppressed STEN enabled saboteurs to conduct close-range elimination of German personnel in circumstances where any audible weapon would have been catastrophic. Danish resistance networks, supported by SOE supply drops, used the weapon in operations against collaborators and informants throughout 1943 and 1944, as the resistance grew from tentative acts of defiance into a highly organized paramilitary network. The psychological effect on German forces is difficult to quantify precisely, but there is one piece of testimony that illuminates it with particular clarity. Otto Skorzeny, the SS Obersturmbannführer, who had led the audacious rescue of Benito Mussolini from his mountain prison in September 1943, and who was by any measure one of the most accomplished and clear-sighted special operations commanders in the German armed forces, went to considerable lengths to obtain a suppressed STEN after encountering the weapon's effects in the field. When he finally acquired one, he was moved to write with what can only be described as undisguised admiration. He noted the splendid possibilities that such silencers offered, the losses they might save, the dangers they might avert, the freedom they provided to engage an unexpected enemy detachment without the sound carrying to alert others nearby. From a man who had made his reputation through precisely this kind of audacious, calculated violence, that observation carries considerable weight. The Germans were impressed enough to catalog their captured examples under the designation MP751E, treating them as a weapon worthy of formal classification in their own inventory. The American approach to the same problem produced a different result. The United States Office of Strategic Services, the OSS-SOE's American counterpart, adapted the M3A1 submachine gun, the ungainly but reliable .45 caliber weapon known informally as the grease gun, for suppressed operation. The American solution was competent and functional, but it was substantially heavier than the British weapon. The M3A1 itself weighed over 3.5 kilograms unloaded, and the suppressor added further bulk. The standard STEN weighed approximately 2.9 kilograms. The suppressed version, despite its considerable barrel assembly, remained lighter and more compact than its American equivalent when disassembled for transport. The STEN's simplicity, the feature that had been its most criticized characteristic when it was first introduced, became, in the suppressed configuration, its greatest operational advantage. A simpler mechanism meant fewer points of failure in field conditions, easier maintenance by operatives with no gunsmithing background, and faster reassembly in darkness and under pressure. Germany produced no equivalent. The Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS operated suppressed weapons of various kinds throughout the war, but no German suppressed submachine gun entered mass production or achieved the systematic distribution that the Mark II-S managed across occupied Europe. The Beretta Model 38, favored by some German units, was adaptable but was never developed into a standard suppressed configuration. German special operations units, when they wanted a genuinely quiet automatic weapon, frequently relied on captured British examples, a remarkable inversion that speaks directly to the quality of what the engineers at Enfield and Station 9 had created. The legacy of the suppressed STEN extends far beyond 1945 in ways that are both improbable and entirely characteristic of the British military's tendency to keep using things long after everyone else has moved on to something newer. The British Army officially declared the Mark II-S obsolete in April 1945. It continued to use it in Malaya, then in Kenya, then in Cyprus. Special Air Service units clung to their suppressed STENs through the 1970s, eventually surrendering them to suppressed versions of the Heckler & Koch MP5 only in the early 1980s, nearly 4 decades after the weapon's nominal obsolescence. Australian SAS units deployed the Mark II-S and its Mark VI successor in Vietnam during the 1960s. American Special Operations teams operating in Southeast Asia under the Military Assistance Command adopted the weapon for long-range reconnaissance, prisoner snatches, and the more ambiguous operations that official histories tend to leave undetailed. They valued, above everything else, the same characteristic that the French farmer in the dark field had valued in 1943, that it was small, reliable, and effectively silent. Examples survive in a handful of collections. The Imperial War Museum in London holds several variants, including the SOE configuration with its well silencer. The National Firearms Centre in Leeds, housed within the Royal Armouries, maintains examples from the Pattern Room collection that allow a direct comparison between the Royal Small Arms Factory model and the SOE variant. The Springfield Armory National Historic Site in Massachusetts holds examples as well, a reminder that the weapon crossed the Atlantic in both directions, through both official channels and the hands of veterans who understood what they carried. Return, then, to that French field in March 1943. The sentries are gone. The darkness is unchanged. The man in the farmer's jacket has already disassembled the weapon and is moving again through the hedgerows towards the rendezvous point. By morning, he will be in an ordinary house on an ordinary street, the STEN packed away inside a piece of farm equipment, indistinguishable from the 1,000 other men in the town going about their morning routines. The Germans at the checkpoint do not know what he was carrying. They do not know what happened to their comrades at the gate. They do not know precisely where the threat came from, or how it came and went without a sound. That was the point. Britain, in 1940, was a country stripped of its conventional military options, standing largely alone against a continental empire that had defeated every army sent against it in 2 years. What it produced in those circumstances, in requisitioned country houses, in a factory in Enfield, in workshops that officially did not exist, was a weapon that could be carried inside a rucksack and used in a crowded street without anyone knowing. It armed civilians with no military training across 6 occupied countries. It gave those civilians, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, students, the technical means to reach into the machinery of the occupation and remove, precisely and quietly, the individual components that kept it running. The suppressed STEN Mark II S was never the most sophisticated weapon of the Second World War. It was not the most powerful, the most accurate, or the most elegant. It was manufactured from steel tubing and sheet metal stampings to a specification that could be reproduced in a workshop without specialized machinery. Its baffles wore out, its canvas barrel cover scorched, its bolt rattled faintly against its receiver even when the gun was silent. But in the darkness of occupied Europe, in the silence before dawn, when everything depended on nothing being heard, it was, without question, exactly enough.